The year was 1861. The United States stood fractured, wounded, unstable, and dangerously close to falling apart. The Union desperately needed commanders, yet the men who would answer that call were not legends at the time. They were regular officers, inexperienced, unsure, and often unready for the storm ahead. But across 4 brutal years of violence and turmoil, these generals would carve their names into history. Some would be celebrated as saviors, others remembered as warnings. Every one of them bore the crushing responsibility of a nation's fate. This is the story of 15 Union generals, how they triumphed, how they stumbled, and how they preserved the United States of America. 1. Ulysses S. Grant, the unyielding commander. Grant's path to war was not marked by honor. It began with disgrace. Before the Civil War erupted, he was a fallen officer, pushed out of the army and reduced to selling firewood just to live. But when the Union needed soldiers, Grant returned and altered the course of the war. At Fort Donelson, he revealed his resolve for the first time. When Confederate leaders requested negotiation, Grant replied with a single demand: unconditional surrender. It was daring, unexpected, and precisely the resolve the Union had been lacking. At Shiloh, Union forces were caught unaware, suffering massive losses in a sudden Confederate assault. Grant, however, refused to withdraw. On the second day, he struck back, transforming near catastrophe into success. Then came Vicksburg, the campaign that defined him. Grant drove his army deep into Mississippi, severed his own supply routes, and surrounded the fortified city until hunger forced its surrender. The win split the Confederacy in half and elevated Grant to national fame. Yet Grant's greatest weapon, his constant aggression, was also his weakness. At Cold Harbor, repeated frontal attacks led to more than 7,000 Union deaths in under an hour. Critics branded him the Butcher. Still, Grant grasped a truth many others did not. The war would not end until Confederate armies were crushed. He carried that responsibility alone. In April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The reserved man from Ohio had achieved what few believed possible. He prevailed because he would not quit, and he failed only in the terrible cost paid to secure victory. 2. William T. Sherman, the flame that shattered the South. If Grant served as the Union's hammer, Sherman was its wildfire. He understood war as it truly existed, not a contest of honor, but an engine built to destroy. Early in the conflict, the sheer scale of the chaos overwhelmed him, leading to a mental collapse. Many believed his career was over. But when Sherman returned, he returned hardened, with fury and purpose. In Atlanta, he smashed Confederate defenses, then ordered the city burned so it could never be used against the Union again. And when he launched his march to the sea, he transformed total war into deliberate policy. Sherman's forces cut a 60-mile-wide scar through Georgia, wrecking railroads, factories, farms, and cities alike. He wasn't just fighting soldiers. He was crushing the South's ability and desire to continue. His victories came from mastering psychological warfare. His failure lay in the terror his methods inflicted on civilians. Even today, across much of the South, his name is spoken with bitterness. But to the Union, Sherman was the man who finished the war without another Gettysburg. 3. George H. Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. He lacked flair. He avoided spectacle. But when everything else fell apart, George Thomas refused to move. At Chickamauga, Union lines collapsed into chaos. Units fled, panic spread, yet Thomas stood firm. For hours, he held his ground against repeated Confederate attacks, preserving the Army of the Cumberland from total ruin. From that moment on, he was known as the Rock of Chickamauga. Later, at Nashville, Thomas delivered one of the war's most decisive victories, completely destroying Hood's army in a flawlessly executed offensive. He prepared methodically, attacked with precision, and achieved absolute success. Yet caution defined his weakness. He delayed too often, waiting too long to advance, too long to strike, too long to gamble. Grant grew impatient, labeling him slow, and history largely passed him by. Among his soldiers, however, Thomas was deeply respected. A commander of iron discipline and quiet bravery, he remained loyal to the Union, even while his native Virginia stood with the Confederacy. 4. George G. Meade, the overlooked victor. Few commanders have ever faced greater pressure. Just 3 days before Gettysburg, Meade was given command of the Army of the Potomac. He had barely studied his maps before confronting Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North. For 3 savage days, Meade held his line, at Little Round Top, the Peach Orchard, and during Pickett's charge. When the fighting ended, Lee's army was retreating. It was the most critical Union victory of the entire war. But Meade's mistake followed immediately. He chose not to chase Lee. The Confederate army escaped across the Potomac. President Lincoln was enraged, calling it a golden opportunity lost. Meade had won the greatest battle ever fought on American soil. Yet he was soon eclipsed by the commander who followed, Ulysses S. Grant. His reputation faded in Grant's shadow, but historians still recognize him for what he truly was, the man who crushed the Confederacy's final chance for victory. 5. Philip Sheridan, the Cavalry of Lightning. Sheridan introduced speed and violence on a new scale. Small in stature but explosive in spirit, he transformed cavalry into a force of devastation. In the Shenandoah Valley, his campaign was ruthless. Barns burned, crops destroyed, railways torn apart, crippling the South's primary food supply. At Cedar Creek, when Union forces were caught off guard and nearly defeated, Sheridan famously rode 20 miles to the battlefield, rallied his troops, and reversed disaster into triumph. His drive was unmatched. His soldiers admired him, his enemies dreaded him, but that ferocity carried consequences. After the war, Sheridan employed the same brutal methods against Native American tribes in the West, leaving a legacy that remains fiercely debated. He embodied total war, fast, unforgiving, and relentless. 6. Winfield Scott, the plan of the old soldier. He never commanded troops in battle during the Civil War. Age, illness, and physical decline kept him from the field. Yet Winfield Scott may have been the sharpest military mind of them all. At the war's outset, he proposed a strategy that politicians openly mocked: seal off southern ports, seize control of the Mississippi River, and slowly choke the Confederacy into submission. They named it the Anaconda Plan and laughed. 4 years later, that very plan delivered victory. Grant secured the Mississippi. Sherman cut the Confederacy in two. The Union Navy's blockade strangled Southern trade. Scott saw the full scope of the conflict long before others did. Total war in strategic form. His only failure was age. He could not execute the plan himself. But through foresight rather than gunfire, he played a crucial role in saving the Union. 7. Winfield S. Hancock, the soldier's general. Striking, fearless, and deeply respected by the troops he commanded, Winfield Scott Hancock embodied the ideal field commander. At Gettysburg, as the Union center buckled under the weight of Pickett's charge, Hancock rode straight into the chaos. Artillery shells burst nearby, musket fire ripped through the air. Yet he remained mounted, calmly directing his men amid the storm. Wounded severely, he was nearly killed, but refused to leave the field until victory was secured. Hancock's strength was leadership through personal bravery. His mere presence could transform fear into resolve. His shortcoming came later, away from the battlefield, in politics. He sought the presidency, but the nation judged politicians differently from warriors. Even so, his soldiers gave him a lasting title, the Superb. A commander who led from the front and never demanded sacrifices he would not make himself. 8. George B. McClellan. The gifted letdown. Few Union generals inspired such devotion from their troops or such frustration from their president as George B. McClellan. After the disaster at Bull Run, he inherited a broken, demoralized force and reshaped it into the Army of the Potomac. Organized, disciplined, and battle-ready. His men adored him, affectionately calling him Little Mac. But McClellan's brilliance in preparation was matched by hesitation in combat. He consistently overestimated Confederate strength, convinced that Lee's forces vastly outnumbered his own. During the Peninsula Campaign, he advanced toward Richmond at a crawl, allowing Lee to strike repeatedly. At Antietam, McClellan possessed Lee's own battle plans, found wrapped around a cigar, yet still delayed. The result was the bloodiest single day in American history. Lee escaped. The war dragged on. Lincoln's patience ran out. McClellan built the army that ultimately won the war, but failed to wield it decisively. He could prepare endlessly for victory, but never deliver the final blow. 9. Joseph Hooker. The confident rebuilder. Fighting Joe. Hooker was everything McClellan was not: aggressive, outspoken, and supremely confident. When he assumed command in 1863, the Army of the Potomac was exhausted and dispirited. Hooker rebuilt it completely, improving food, medical care, intelligence, and morale. He forged an army that looked ready to crush the Confederacy. But at Chancellorsville, confidence turned into catastrophe. Outnumbered 2-1, Lee split his forces and attacked. Hooker froze. Stunned by the boldness of the maneuver, he lost control of the fight, and the Union Army withdrew in confusion. Hooker's reforms strengthened the army, but his ego and indecision destroyed his opportunity for greatness. He spoke like a conqueror, yet faltered when history demanded action. 10. Ambrose Burnside. The faithful and forsaken. After repeated failures, no one wanted command of the Army of the Potomac. Ambrose Burnside accepted the role, not out of desire but duty. He was honest, brave, and deeply loyal to the Union. But courage could not shield him from one of the war's worst catastrophes. Fredericksburg. Burnside ordered repeated frontal assaults against fortified Confederate troops positioned behind a stone wall. The result was a massacre, 12,000 Union casualties in a single day. His men admired his sincerity and personal bravery, but pitied his command. Later, at the crater outside Petersburg, Burnside's bold plan to detonate explosives beneath Confederate lines collapsed due to poor execution and political meddling. Once again, thousands died. Burnside succeeded in loyalty and compassion, but failed in judgment and battlefield leadership. A tragic commander who earned his soldiers' respect, but not their victories. 11. John A. Logan. The General of the People. John A. Logan was not trained as a soldier. He was a politician. But when war came, he left Congress, took up arms, and led from the front. At Belmont, Vicksburg, and Atlanta, Logan proved himself a natural battlefield leader. He inspired not through rank, but presence. When General McPherson was killed at Atlanta, Logan assumed command amid chaos, rallying broken units, restoring order, and holding the line. He refused to let the army collapse. Logan's strength was raw courage and charisma, leadership born of instinct, not classrooms. His weakness was politics. He was never fully accepted into the inner circle of Grant and Sherman. As a result, he never received the command his talent merited. To the soldiers who followed him, however, he was one of their own, a leader who fought in smoke and mud, not from a distant headquarters. 12th, John Pope. The Loud Commander. John Pope arrived in the East full of confidence and bold promises, fresh from success in the Western theater, including the capture of Island No. 10. Lincoln hoped Pope would bring new energy to Virginia. But Pope talked more than he planned. He ridiculed cautious Eastern generals, boasting that his headquarters would be in the saddle. Then came Second Bull Run. Lee and Jackson completely outmaneuvered him. Pope's army was crushed. His reputation collapsed overnight. Arrogance blinded him to the enemy's brilliance. After defeat, Pope was quietly reassigned to the frontier, far from national attention. He succeeded as a confident commander in the West, but failed in the East by underestimating the mind he faced. 13. Lew Wallace. The general who redeemed himself. Today, Lew Wallace is remembered as the author of Ben-Hur, but during the war, he was a general seeking redemption. At Shiloh, Wallace's division arrived late, contributing to devastating Union losses. Grant blamed him, and Wallace carried that stigma for years. Then came 1864. At Monocacy, Wallace led just 6,000 men against 15,000 Confederates marching toward Washington, D.C. He knew victory was impossible, but delay was everything. Wallace fought anyway. By holding the enemy for an entire day, he bought time for reinforcements to defend the capital. Monocacy became known as the battle that saved Washington. In one stand, Wallace erased years of failure, proving that even defeat can lead to lasting legacy. 14. John G. Foster. The architect of victory. John G. Foster was no battlefield celebrity. He was the engineer who made triumph possible. A West Point graduate and veteran of the Mexican War, Foster specialized in fortifications, logistics, and siege warfare. He designed defenses, bridges, and supply networks that enabled campaigns like Sherman's March and the Carolinas offensives. At New Bern and Charleston, his planning delivered rare early Union successes. Though seldom in the spotlight, his influence was everywhere, from railroads to artillery placements. Foster won by thinking ahead, long before shots were fired. His only failure was obscurity. Overshadowed by louder commanders, he shaped victories without ever owning the headlines. 15. David Hunter. The general who chose freedom. David Hunter was among the war's most controversial figures, and its most principled. While others fought solely to preserve the Union, Hunter fought to end slavery. In 1862, he issued an order emancipating enslaved people in his military district, before Lincoln had written the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln revoked the order, but Hunter forced the issue into national consciousness. Militarily, his record was uneven. His Shenandoah campaign failed against Confederate General Jubal Early, but Hunter transformed the Union Army by recruiting and commanding black regiments. His victory was moral rather than tactical. He fought for a cause greater than battlefield success: freedom itself. Though flawed as a commander, his courage permanently altered the purpose of the war. 15 men. Different origins, personalities, and fates, united by one impossible mission: to preserve a nation tearing itself apart. Grant, unyielding. Sherman, Ruthless brilliance. Thomas, immovable. Sheridan, thunder in motion. Meade, the overlooked victor. Scott, the visionary strategist. Hancock, Gettysburg's hero. McClellan, the builder who hesitated. Hooker, the reformer who faltered. Burnside, faithful yet tragic. Logan, the people's fighter. Pope, undone by pride. Wallace, redeemed by resolve. Foster, the unseen architect. Hunter, the moral crusader. Together they carried the burden of freedom. Through triumph and failure alike, they proved one enduring truth. The Union survived not through perfection, but because men refused to stop fighting for it. The Civil War forged legends and left scars that never faded. But these were the generals who turned defeat into resolve, and chaos into a nation reborn. Which one is your favorite, and why? Like and subscribe for more.